You are camped on a strip of marsh grass at the edge of what will one day be called the North Sea. It is roughly 6,200 BCE. Smoke drifts from a fire built on dried peat. The tide line behind you sits 12 feet higher than it did in your grandmother's time, and the herons that used to nest a half-day's walk inland are gone. In the next few hours, a collapse on the seafloor 300 miles north will send a wall of water straight at you. You can watch a storm form on a screen days before it makes landfall. The people in that marsh had no such warning. No satellites, no seawalls, no broadcast. So how did people with no instruments and no infrastructure survive floods large enough to swallow entire coastlines, and in some cases, remember them accurately for thousands of years afterward? In 2014, archaeologist Vince Gaffney at the University of Bradford led a project called Europe's Lost Frontiers, using seismic data originally collected for North Sea oil surveys to reconstruct Doggerland, a landmass roughly the size of Britain that once connected England to mainland Europe. His team traced the region's final flooding to around 6,200 BCE, when an underwater landslide off Norway's coast, known as the Storge Slide, triggered a tsunami. Sediment cores pulled from the Shetland Islands show wave deposits consistent with a surge that may have reached over 5 meters in some coastal stretches. For people living on Doggerland's rivers and marshes, this wasn't a slow encroachment. It was minutes, not centuries. The sea didn't creep in here, it arrived like something being outrun. So, what happened to the people who lived through it? A different flood was building roughly 1,000 years later, on the other side of Europe. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory proposed that the Black Sea Basin, then a freshwater lake sitting well below global sea level, was breached by rising Mediterranean water pushing through the Bosphorus Strait. Their model suggested the shoreline could have advanced by as much as a mile a day, eventually flooding an estimated 60,000 square miles of land that had been dry and farmable. Some researchers dispute the exact speed of the event. The science here is still genuinely debated. What isn't disputed is the sediment record itself, a clear, rapid marine layer sitting on top of what used to be freshwater terrain. An entire agricultural world, gone in the time it takes one harvest to fail. Everyone assumes people this far back had no way to prepare for disaster, that they simply got caught. Actually, archaeologists working flood-prone regions from Doggerland to the Persian Gulf Basin keep finding the same pattern. Permanent structures on high ground, and lower land used only seasonally, never built on. Nobody wrote that rule down. It just survived. Some of the clearest proof that ancient people didn't just survive floods but deliberately remembered them comes from Australia. In 2016, geographer Patrick Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reid, working through the University of the Sunshine Coast, published an analysis of 21 Aboriginal oral traditions describing coastlines that no longer exist. Islands now underwater, rivers that used to run where open sea sits today. Matching the described geography against sea level data, they estimated the events being described happened between 7 and 10,000 years ago. That means some of these stories were carried largely intact for roughly 300 generations, with no writing system involved at any point. 300 generations of accurate transmission is a hard number worth sitting with. The warning system ancient humans built wasn't concrete or sensors. It was language, repeated on purpose. For millennia, but there's a problem with treating old stories as hard data. Genetic anthropologist Stephen Oppenheimer raised exactly that problem in 1998. In his book Eden in the East, arguing that flood myths scattered across Southeast Asia may trace back to the drowning of Sundaland, a shelf of land larger than India that once connected Sumatra, Java, and Borneo to the Asian mainland before post-glacial seas swallowed most of it between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago. Oppenheimer's specific theory remains contested, and the exact timeline of Sundaland's flooding is still debated among researchers. What isn't contested is the geology underneath the theory. Southeast Asia's continental shelf did flood dramatically as ice sheets melted, redrawing coastlines by hundreds of miles in places. Whether or not every myth traces cleanly to one event, the flooding itself isn't folklore. It happened, repeatedly, to people standing on real ground. Everyone assumes flood myths are exaggerated bedtime stories, filed away next to dragons and giants. Actually, when researchers plot the geography described in dozens of these stories against known sea level data, an unsettling number of them line up. Not perfectly, but close enough to keep serious people asking questions. So what actually kept people alive when the water came? Not weapons, not shelters. Nothing built in this period could outlast a tsunami or a mile-a-day shoreline. The real survival tool was information, passed person to person, generation to generation, wrapped in stories so it wouldn't get lost along the way. A flood account told as myth survives, because people want to repeat it by a fire. A flood account delivered as a flat warning usually doesn't. Doggerland taught people the sea could take everything in an afternoon. The Black Sea Basin taught them it could also take everything over a matter of weeks. Neither disaster came with instructions. What came after, in both places, was memory, built on purpose to outlast the people who lived through the disaster it described. Picture that marsh again. The tide already 12 feet higher than it should be, The bird's long since gone. Somewhere in that camp is someone who decides, without being told, to move to higher ground before the water arrives. Somewhere after that is someone else who turns what happened into a story, so their grandchildren will know to do the same thing without having to learn it the hard way. Right now, you have satellites, sensors, and apps that can predict disaster days in advance, and most people still ignore the warning until the water is at the door. Ancient humans had none of that technology. What they had was a habit modern life mostly let go of. They listened to the story, and they believed it.